Hello everyone. This is the fourth video in the Monopoly series of videos on this YouTube channel. This video is going to be kind of broken down into two separate parts. The first part of the video, we're going to be talking about the welfare costs of monopoly. Basically, we're going to be talking about how a monopoly usually, well, always does not maximize the total surplus of society. It doesn't make society as well off as it could be when there is a monopoly producing a good or a service. The second half of the video, we're going to be introducing the idea of price discrimination and talk about what that means and how a monopolist could potentially use price discrimination to make society better off. So let's go ahead and get into the video, starting with the welfare cost of monopoly. So if you guys remember, when we introduced the idea of total surplus back in chapter 3, we mentioned that total surplus is maximized at the market equilibrium. In other words, total surplus, or the benefits to both consumers and producers, are maximized at the competitive market equilibrium. So the most number of buyers and the most number of sellers are as good as they can be when the market for a good or a service is producing the market equilibrium quantity and charging the market equilibrium price. So we learned that back in chapter 3, that markets are generally thought of as a good way to organize economic activity because the most number of buyers and sellers are made as well off as they can be. But we've learned in the last couple videos that the monopolist does not charge the same, perfect competition price or even produce the same perfect competition quantity. And because of this, it actually creates a loss to society overall. So more specifically, the value to buyers of an additional unit, or the price, exceeds the cost of resources needed to produce that unit. So in perfect competition, price and marginal costs are exactly equal to one another. But we learned in the last couple videos that a monopolist is able to charge a price that is much higher than both their marginal revenue and marginal cost. So because of this, a monopoly produces a quantity that is technically too low or not enough compared to what would have been produced if the market was perfectly competitive. And because a monopoly produces a quantity that is too low, we call this a deadweight loss to society. So you can think about a deadweight loss as any kind of lost consumption or production that society no longer has the chance to even consume if they wanted to. A monopoly is not producing enough of this product compared to what would be produced under perfect competition. So there are certain people that under perfect competition could have bought this good and have benefited from this good. But now, if there is a monopoly, not enough of the good is produced. So hopefully this idea is explained a little bit better using this picture. So we have a demand curve and a marginal cost curve. You can kind of think of the marginal cost curve like a supply curve. in this instance. So if we were to find the competitive market equilibrium, the equilibrium is where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. In this instance, like I said, you can think of the marginal cost curve acting like the supply curve. So here, where these two curves intersect, this will be the quantity that would have been produced if we're talking about a perfectly competitive market. And the price that this perfectly competitive market would sell this product for is right there. So remember, in perfect competition, the price is equal to the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. All of those values are equal to one another. So this would be the basic competitive equilibrium that we've already spent a lot of time in class and in the last chapter developing this idea. How does this change this equilibrium when we are talking about a monopoly? Well, to find the quantity and the price for a profit maximizing monopoly, we also need to draw in that marginal revenue curve. So whenever we're trying to find the monopoly equilibrium, the first step, remember, is to find the intersection point between marginal revenue and marginal cost. This intersection point right here gives us the quantity that the monopolist would produce. And from this intersection point, we go straight up to the demand curve because since there's no competition, a monopolist can charge the highest willingness to pay that a consumer is willing to pay for this quantity. So we go straight up to the demand curve here, and we see that at this point, this determines the price. So again, comparing perfect competition to monopoly, we see that a perfectly competitive market produces more and charges a lower price compared to a monopolist who produces less and charges more for that. We can represent this dead weight loss to society as this little triangle here. So basically, the height of the triangle represents the fact that there are these people on this part of the demand curve that no longer get to even have the chance to consume the product. Not enough of the product is made for everyone who wants it to buy it, if we're comparing perfect competition and monopoly. And the base of this triangle here, we could kind of think of it like a monopoly markup, in that the monopolist gets to charge a much higher price for this quote unquote limited amount of goods. So, main takeaway that I want you guys to remember from these last couple of slides is that perfect competition maximizes total surplus or total welfare of society. The most number of buyers and the most number of sellers are made well off given the price and quantity chosen by the market equilibrium. A monopoly does not maximize the total welfare of society. It results in what's called a deadweight loss, in that not only does the monopolist produce less of the product compared to a perfectly competitive market, they also charge a higher price for that limited amount of production. So society is not as well off as it could be because of this monopoly. And even though the monopoly is doing exactly, what it should in terms of maximizing its profits, it's not as good as it can be for society as a whole, if that makes sense. So the second half of this video, we're going to be introducing this idea of price discrimination. And price discrimination is actually something that is pretty common in many different types of markets and industries. But if we specifically apply this idea of price discrimination, an interesting result kind of appears in that if a monopoly is able to perfectly price discriminate, they could actually raise the social welfare of society and raise it to a point where it actually mimics the outcome of a perfectly competitive market. Now, we may agree or disagree about, the monopolist's means to perfectly price discriminate, but we will introduce that here in a second. So what exactly is price discrimination? Well, price discrimination basically means that a producer of a good or a service is able to charge different prices to different buyers for the same exact good. So we'll introduce some ideas and examples of price discrimination here in a little while, but just keep in mind that price discrimination basically means that a firm can increase their profit by charging a higher price to buyers with a higher willingness to pay. So if a firm or a business is able to separate customers according to their willingness to pay, the business could potentially charge people different prices. So I like to use the example in class that I like coffee. And if there was just, if there was a business that is selling coffee in town, and if they're able to somehow infer that I have a high willingness to pay for coffee, they could potentially charge me a higher price for coffee versus someone else who may not have a high willingness to pay for coffee and charge them a lower price. But by doing this, the firm could actually increase their total profit because they might be able to capture more people to sell their product to. And we'll show that here graphically in a second. And actually, by doing this, it could raise economic welfare by the definition of economic welfare that we have been using so far in the class, and that is maximizing total surplus. So the most number of buyers and the most number of sellers are as good as they can be in, this example. So if a monopolist, for example, is able to perfectly price discriminate, charge every single person a different price according to their maximum willingness to pay, the monopolist gets the entire consumer surplus. So basically, none of the buyers in this market would capture any consumer surplus. It would all just be transferred to the monopolist in terms of profit. So thinking back to that coffee example again, I think I gave the example of like, if I'm willing to pay $5 for a cup of coffee, and let's say a perfectly competitive firm is, charging $3 for a cup of coffee, and I go and buy a cup of coffee for $3, even though I was willing to pay $5, I would get a consumer surplus of $2, right? I was willing to pay $5, but I only had to pay $3. So I kind of got this $2 extra, this consumer surplus for me. But if a monopolist is able to charge people their exact willingness to pay, then there would be no consumer surplus. It would all go straight to the monopolist. So again, if I'm willing to pay $5 for a cup of coffee and there's only one business in town that sells coffee, and I walk in and they have some kind of scanner or something that's able to determine that I am willing to pay $5 for a cup of coffee, then they're going to charge me $5. I can't go anywhere else to buy coffee because they're the only business in town that sells coffee. So if somehow they're able to determine my exact willingness to pay, they would charge me my exact willingness to pay. I would get zero consumer surplus, and they would get all of what would have been consumer surplus in terms of profit for them. And by doing this, if the monopolist is able to figure this out for every single customer, there would technically be no deadweight loss to society. So even though the consumers aren't getting any extra benefits, because the one single producer is getting all of the extra benefits, by the definition of what we're calling economic welfare, society is better off. Okay, so this picture should look relatively familiar, and it shows the profit maximizing choice for a monopolist. If the monopolist was only able to charge one price for the good that they're producing. So again, to find the quantity, we look at marginal revenue and marginal cost intersection. So the monopolist would make this amount and charge this one single price if they had to charge the same price to everyone. So here the monopolist charges the same price to all buyers. Everyone pays this PM price here. So that means there are still some consumers that get some consumer surplus from paying this price. Particularly, it would be these people that lie on this part of the demand curve. These people on this part of the demand curve are willing to pay this price and this price for this good that the monopoly is producing, but they only have to pay this price. So even though it is much higher than what it would be in perfect competition, there are still a few people that would benefit from paying this price. They would get some consumer surplus from this price. So consumer surplus is the triangle below the demand curve and above the price that's being charged. The potential profit that the monopolist makes is represented here in this square. So essentially, they are selling this many goods for this price. So this rectangle here would be total revenue. But it's costing them this much to make the goods. So the money that is left over, the monopolist profit, can be represented by this rectangle here. And like we discussed in a couple slides ago, this triangle here represents the deadweight loss to society. If the monopolist is only able to charge one price for everyone, then these people on this part of the demand curve that would have liked to have bought the product under perfect competition can no longer see any reason to buy the product. The price that the monopolist is charging is too high for these people to benefit. And even if, it wasn't a necessity for them to buy this product, the monopolist isn't even making enough of the product to cover all of these people. They're only making this much, and for these people to even have a chance to buy the product, they need to be making this much. So again, if the monopolist is only charging one price for everyone, there are some people that do benefit and get a consumer surplus. The monopolist benefits by making a profit by charging that higher price. But these people over here on the demand curve that could have bought this product under perfect competition can no longer even find the product to buy. There's not enough of the product being made. Now what happens if the monopolist is able to perfectly price discriminate? So if the monopolist is able to perfectly price discriminate, in other words, know every single customer's exact willingness to pay, there now becomes an incentive for the monopolist to produce more of the product, right? If the monopolist is able to know every single person's willingness to pay, they could potentially make a profit off of everyone that walks in to buy their product. Even these people that were down here on this part of the demand curve that couldn't buy the product before, now the monopolist thinks it's worth it to sell the product to them if the monopolist is able to know their exact willingness to pay. So here the monopolist produces the competitive quantity but charges each buyer his or her willingness to pay. This is called perfect price discrimination. So here, because the monopolist is able to know everyone's exact willingness to pay, there is no consumer surplus. The monopolist is able to capture what would have been the consumer surplus as profit for itself. And even though this sounds counterintuitive, this actually makes society as a whole better off, because now these people on this part of the demand curve at least get to buy the product now. There's enough product available for these people to actually buy the product, where before the monopolist wasn't making enough for everyone to get the product. And because of this perfect price discrimination, there's no deadweight loss. The monopolist is producing enough for the maximum number of people to potentially benefit, to potentially consume this product. But, you know, kind of like perfect competition, perfect price discrimination is not really possible in the real world. It's not possible for me to walk into a business and that business automatically knows my exact willingness to pay for that product. That's something that I know, but is not necessarily revealed to the business and the business owner. So they can't really exploit that, you know, I may have a higher willingness to pay for some goods versus other goods, so they could potentially charge me higher prices for those goods that I have a higher willingness to pay. This isn't possible in the real world. It just doesn't happen like that. So again, no firm knows every buyer's willingness to pay, and buyers probably are unlikely to tell sellers straight up what their willingness to pay is too. So I wouldn't walk into a coffee shop and say, I'm willing to pay $5 for that, even though the price says $3. I wouldn't say that. I would just pay $3 and be on my way. But, you know, even though perfect price discrimination doesn't really happen in the real world, there is still examples, very common examples of price discrimination that happens in many industries, you know, across the world. Firms divide customers into groups based on some observable trait that is likely related to willingness to pay. So we're going to go through a few examples of some, you know, real world price discrimination examples. So one, you know, probably pretty obvious example of price discrimination would be movie tickets. Movie tickets offer discounts for senior citizens and for students and for people who attend during weekday afternoons. People that go to the movies on a Tuesday afternoon pay a different price for the same movie versus someone who went to see that movie on a Friday night. So the people that go on Tuesday afternoon have kind of revealed to the movie theater that they have a lower willingness to pay than people who pay full price on Friday night. So price discrimination, remember, is just people getting charged different prices for the same good. And movie ticket discounts are one example of price discrimination. Another example of price discrimination is airline prices. So depending on what day you buy your airline ticket, whenever we can start traveling again, whatever day you buy your airline ticket, you may pay a different price if you book your flight for Tuesday versus if you book your flight for Friday night. So again, business travelers may have a higher willingness to pay for certain airline tickets versus more price-sensitive leisure travelers. So people that are buying an airline ticket for vacation may want to shop around some more and find the lowest possible price for their airline ticket versus someone who has to travel for business and needs the flight for that specific day. Maybe people that are going on vacation can be a little bit more flexible about the day that they leave and the time that they leave, but business travelers may have a higher willingness to pay because, they may need to get somewhere for a conference or something that day. So again, the same flight could cost people two vastly different amounts depending on the day that it's booked and the reason that the flight is booked in the first place. Discount coupons is another example of price discrimination. So people who have time to clip and organize coupons are more likely to have a lower income and a lower willingness to pay than others. So people that take the time to clip coupons and go to the store and use those coupons to buy groceries or something, they are going to be paying a lower price for groceries versus someone else who doesn't have coupons with them. It's the same exact groceries, but people that have coupons are paying a different price. This is price discrimination. Need-based financial aid is also another example of price discrimination. So all of you who are watching this video are, getting the same exact videos and education from me, but some of you may have paid a different price to the university versus others. So some of you may have scholarships and other kind of grants and things like that you may have gotten that now you pay out of pocket a lower price for your education versus someone who doesn't have as many scholarships or grants and things like that. So even though you're getting the same education, you're watching the same videos from me, teaching you about economics, you may have paid a different price to the university to get this education. So need-based financial aid, or just financial aid in general, is another example of price discrimination. And then another example, and this will be the example that I end this video with, is just quantity discounts. So a buyer's willingness to pay often declines with additional units. So firms charge less per unit for large quantities than small ones. So this is basically just buying in bulk. So if you go to Costco or Sam's Club and you buy, toilet paper, paper towels in bulk, you'll be paying a lower price per paper towel roll or per toilet paper roll versus if you went to Kroger and bought the same exact toilet paper or paper towels in a smaller package. So buying in bulk is another example of price discrimination. So again, just to kind of recap, price discrimination is charging a different price for different people for the same exact good. And if a monopolist somehow, in theory, was able to perfectly price discriminate, they would find it, advantageous to produce a higher quantity that is very similar or exactly the same as the quantity that is produced in perfect competition. If this monopolist is able to perfectly price discriminate, that means that society is better off because now more people are able to consume the product that the monopolist created, and this gets rid of the deadweight loss that is made when a monopolist is just acting self-interested and that they're only worried about maximizing their own profit. So the next video in this series kind of pivots a little bit and looks at the public policy responses to monopolies. So now we've talked about, why monopolies exist, how do they maximize profits. The next video is talking about, since monopolies do exist due to these barriers to entry, what can the government do or not do about monopolies if they think that the monopoly is being unfair with the price that they're charging or the quantity that they're producing.